Stakeholder.
In gambling, an independent party with whom each of those who make a wager deposits the money or counters wager.
A person with an interest or concern in something, especially a business.
In emergency management, any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival and recovery of a given community. You.
Welcome to Stakeholder Prepping.
Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 3 of Stakeholder Prepping, where you, yes, you, are the primary stakeholder in your own survival, bringing the tactical from the practical. We are your hosts. My name is Chris.
And I'm AC.
And today we are really going to dive into the meat and potatoes of really what started this podcast for us in the first place. We asked you guys to give us a trial run of 3 episodes. So here we are. For those of you still listening by the end of this, your tutorial is complete. Welcome to the actual game. But today we're going to be diving into the details on really what the next big one might look like and what the government has been predicting since 9/11. We're going to be opening up some of the history books so we can understand what's been culminating, what's been bubbling, and what that event might look like. So, AC, you're going to kind of give us that up the skirt look at what's going to be coming from the federal government side. And then I'm going to be going into some detail and taking it a step further to talk about some of those simple things you can do to prepare, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, this is sort of what I do in my day job, sort of following the federal money and helping agencies get money for equipment and training. So I've been in this game a long time, and I've seen the trends and I know how it goes. And so I'm basically going to put this together in a very easy to digest format, I guess. We're going to say, here's what the federal government has historically spent money on, and here's what they've said they are going to spend money on and for what reasons. So yeah, I'll just roll into it. Basically, if you go on the Wayback Machine, we're talking post 9/11, the federal government really changed stuff up circa 2002 with the establishment of Department of Homeland Security. That was late 2000, it's November 2002, I guess. So more than 14 months after the September 11th terrorist attack. So the glacial speed, I'd call it the geologic speed almost, at which the federal government moves is super important here. So along with the creation of DHS, the federal government sort of reimagined and re-engineered a lot of our national defense agencies, like the U.S. Coast Guard, which had been under the Department of Treasury from its inceptions in like the 1700s until I think 1967, and then under the Department of Transportation, except in war, until 2003. They also sort of re-engineered Border Patrol. If you remember, they split up CBP or they split up what they called Border Patrol into ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and CBP, which was Customs Border Patrol.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so this is all very important for what we're going to discuss next. So it's not just a super boring history lesson, although it's a little bit of that.
I had my pencil out.
Good. So something else the federal government did during this multi-year shakeup of all these federal agencies is establish a number of funding avenues for federal and state and local agencies, along with new funding mechanisms for partner nations. So the big one, this Port Security Grant Program, PSPG, that started in 2002. It was expanded with Operation Stone Garden in 2006. And this PSPG began under it was part of the Maritime Transportation Security Act, if you remember that, because we never name bills after what we're actually going to spend the money on.
Yeah, for my Homeland Security degree, that was a big part of it, was understanding the Maritime Transportation Security Act.
Right. So Department of Homeland Security, they provide grants to these ports, and Operation Stone Garden is a federal grant program that helps local, state, and even tribal agencies secure U.S. borders. That began in 2006. So FEMA, we all know FEMA, they administer this program, and it's got a budget. Just these programs under the FEMA budget are about $90 million to $100 million a year. and FEMA sends the majority of those funds to U.S.-Mexico border states and delegates funding to states with high level of migratory traffic, international borders, border with international waters, things like that.
Okay.
The program enhances cooperation and coordination between Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies. For example, in March 2015, there's this big joint operation that led to like 2,500 pounds of cocaine worth $32 million. It was this big thing. They want to talk about how the joint funding of these programs culminated in this giant drug bust with all these other agencies helping out that they kind of put together. So
not
today,
not Fast and Furious, because that was all guns.
That was the gun thing. Yeah. Look it up. There was a big one. I think it was under FURA. FURA was the acronym that put all these guys together, and they had this giant drug bust. And it was one of the few times that FEMA got their act together and put the money in the right places, and they did something cool with it. So today, all these grant funding programs, they're managed and administered by FEMA. And according to FEMA, these grants provide state, local, and private sector partners help with critical port infrastructure from, protection from terrorism, enhanced domain awareness, which is kind of where I spend a lot of my world. It improves port-wide maritime security management. It maintains or reestablishes maritime security mitigation protocols. All of this money, which in total is about $1 billion a year. It's over $1 billion with a B. It's over $1 billion a year. It's broken out between PSPG, I talked about this Operation Stone Garden, and UWASI, which is the Urban Area Security Initiative. I won't go into a ton of detail, but we can put the figures up on our website. But basically, if you look all the way back through, funding year or fiscal year 2017, which was our year 2016, it hovered right around $1.1 billion, maybe a little over that every year between all these programs. Now,
That's
why
insane?
It's a shit ton of money. And why is all this important? Well, because the federal government is throwing over $1 billion a year at a problem we don't have yet, and a problem we haven't had since 9/11. So what they're doing with all this money is they're trying to prevent the next 9/11, and they know exactly where the next 9/11 is going to come from. And I am sorry, I'm saying 9/11 a lot, but now a reasonable reaction from any pragmatic person that's smart enough to listen to our podcast would probably be something like, why should I listen to the federal government? They're the ones I'm prepping against. I don't trust anything they have to say, and why would I care about it? And to some extent, I would agree, but here's where I disagree. Remember earlier I was talking about the federal government moving at glacial speed. I would argue that they can usually predict what's coming. They're just terrible at mitigation and prevention. If you take a look at history and all the way back, you could say, they knew Pearl Harbor was coming. They knew that was going to happen. They could tell you even how often, with a pretty good degree of certainty, how often we were going to have a space shuttle disaster. They even predicted it was like 1 in 7 or something. It was like, maybe it was 1 in 13, but they actually knew how often they were going to have an issue with the space shuttle blowing up. And they called them pretty good. And they even predicted COVID. So, even just a couple of months ago, they knew someone was going to take a shot at Trump. Now, none of this is political. And I do want to reiterate that I'd like to stay, and I know, Chris, I'm speaking for you too. We'd like to stay as far away from politics as possible.
100%.
Because, as of late, I would say politics are the antithesis of pragmatism. And by that, I mean, lately, people are so insanely emotional about politics, and we just want to present the facts. And that's why I'm leading with history, and that's why I'm leading with some numbers, because they're really hard to counter. So again, I personally do think the government does a really good job with predicting the future. I just think they're terrible at changing it. And I'm guessing, Chris, you probably have some examples of working on that FEMA side where they're just slow to roll. And once the money gets to a state or local partner, they can move, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this was when I was going for my emergency management degree and the Homeland Security side. There are case study after case study after case study, and we have tons of really historical examples on the government moving super, super slowly and inefficiently when it comes to disaster response. So I want to kind of distinguish here that local governments, they can be extremely responsive, especially if it's something they're trained to because of their location or the conditions around them. So take Cal Fire, California wildfire response into perspective here. Their wildfire response teams are phenomenal. Same with after 2005, the Florida hurricane response, their local teams are excellent at doing exactly what they need to do, getting people evacuated, warning people, tying things down so they don't, put a beach umbrella 50 miles away through somebody's living room or whatever. But at the federal level, it takes a really long time to start up and effectively steer that large of a machine towards an effective response. And one of the big case studies that we went over was constantly just Katrina. So when Katrina happened in 2005, it took the federal government and FEMA, I believe, 4.5 or 5.5 days to get truckloads of water to the Superdome, which was the main refugee camp they had set up. So, you go and you trust the system and you go to this FEMA refugee camp and they don't have the basics. They didn't have toilet paper. They didn't have water. They had thousands upon thousands of MREs, but they didn't have the infrastructure in place for the other critical necessities.
And people got murdered in the Superdome, right? They couldn't even provide security well, right? I mean, wasn't that what's going on? Yeah,
exactly. But a lot of things changed after Katrina, to the point of over response. So I believe it was 2011. Do you remember the earthquake in Haiti?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. So there were donation sites. I know back at the time you could donate on the Xbox network. You could just say, I want to donate $5 and they would charge whatever credit card you had on file, etc.
So when we talk about federal government efficiency, they are actually very efficient at taking our money is what you're saying.
They are very good at it, and they're not the only ones. But during that whole episode and after the earthquake, donations went to FEMA. They went to the American Red Cross. So between the American Red Cross, or ARC, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, they kind of overdid it. And they thought, all right, we're going to have another Katrina level event, or this has been another Katrina level event. We need to get water there fast. Well, they overdid it and they delivered way too much. So currently in 2024, there are still shipping containers on the beaches of Haiti that are completely unopened and filled to the brim with bottled water that have not been opened. They haven't been used, nothing. And it's kind of this dichotomy because it's such a poverty-stricken country that gangs have taken over sections of it while the majority of the population struggles to get by daily. And that's it really comes down to kind of two simple things, right? So the first one is continuity of operations. And this is one of the reasons it takes the government so long to really get started. It's like a diesel engine in the cold versus your gasoline lawnmower at 80 degrees.
Okay.
In a disaster scenario, the goal of the federal government is going to be to respond and assist the people affected by the disaster, but their issue becomes continuity of operations. So they have to stop the spread of the disaster first and foremost so that they can isolate exactly how much aid is needed, how many beans to give each person, right? That takes time. And it's because they want to avoid a cascading failure, which we'll go into detail on what cascading failures are and how they all interlink on another episode. But continuity of operations, or coup, means that the government is going to be stalled from the get-go because they're trying to isolate the incident to a single region. And they start that assessment at kind of that bureaucratic, glacial, geological rate. And then they collect materials, and then they get supplies, and then they actually get into help. So it's a red tape nightmare for them to act efficiently and effectively. And that brings up the second concept, which is scalability.
Okay.
So that's where your local law enforcement comes in. That's where your local responders. So in emergency management, the smallest unit that is capable of handling any sort of situation, they are always the primary responder. For example, you don't see the National Guard being called out for a traffic accident on the highway, right?
Sure.
But let's say that accident causes a wildfire that takes over an entire town and then starts to threaten more and more. Then you start to see National Guard come in. You start to see National Guard from other states that have kind of that mutually supporting agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when it's the smallest unit that can take over. So it can always go larger, but once it goes larger, it can never go smaller. That's how emergency management scalability looks at it.
Interesting.
And that's why it's important. And that's one of the big keys of this whole podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So it all comes back to continuity of operations, the continued survival of the government for the good of the majority of the citizens. If they have all of their eggs in one basket, helping out, 2 million people that were affected by a hurricane,
Mm-hmm.
it opens up gaps that they could have focused on elsewhere. So they don't want to hyper focus on one specific event because they have other fires going all the time, and they can't abandon those to just dedicate all of their resources to one spot, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And it's kind of interesting. So we're talking about how the federal government is so insanely inefficient and very, very slow, but because of that geologic speed, that glacial speed, when they do start moving, it's like a freight train. It doesn't stop. It goes the one direction and it goes. So that's where you lean on those state and local partners that can move quickly. So I like the commentary. So back to the money trail. All of these grant programs we're talking about, they had what was called an award preference. And that means that they would give preferential treatment to grant applications by state and local municipalities that had an emphasis on the technology that they wanted to see deployed. So one of the first things they gave bidding preference to way back when was communications. And Chris, I know you're the comms guy, so I know you're going to geek out about this, but
only a little bit, I promise.
And it was and getting these agencies to work together, right? You couldn't work together if you couldn't communicate. So I remember a handful of years ago, I was working with an agency up in the Northeast, and they were trying to come up with a mesh network for emergency communications. And this was a very wealthy municipality, and that means basically they had the means, motive, and opportunity to install their own mesh network that allowed all of the local agencies around, along with the state and federal partners, to communicate with one another and view assets and information in real time on their own secured network. So a mesh network is basically, Chris, help me out here.
Okay. So coming from the comm side, a mesh network is it's a type of network topology, and we'll kind of touch on topology if we need to at a later point. But every device on that network is called a node, and they're interconnected directly to each other and dynamically to each other, but there's no central point of failure. It's not built like a pyramid. So that means that every node can communicate with multiple others, and when you see a spider web, everywhere that those strings of web connect, think of that as a node. So the defining feature of a mesh network is it doesn't rely on a central router to direct traffic. So instead, every node helps to relay data to other nodes, and it creates a system that's more efficient and more resilient. And so because every node on that network can send and receive data, it can also pass it on to other devices, and it gets to its destination, even if it's not the most direct route. So it can go through, thinking in that spider web, you can go around all of the different sections that have the bad, the flies in it, or the tears in it, things like that. So it's self-healing. And if a node fails or goes offline, the network can automatically reroute data to those alternate nodes, and that makes it more resilient because it is adaptable to change or disruption.
Okay.
The other big thing is it's decentralized. So instead of having a single router, the power goes out or something like that, it finds a different route. So it improves the overall functionality, and it's very, very scalable. You can have a giant network. You can have a tiny network. Adding more points to it doesn't overload the system. Instead, it offers those alternate routes, and it actually improves performance because there's more paths available. So
interesting.
The adaptability of a mesh network is what made it such a preferred method for emergency management, because now you're not talking about just cell towers or ham radios. You're talking about everything can communicate with everything else. And on a full mesh network, every node is directly connected to every other node. On a partial mesh network, you've got this node is connected to, one or two or three other points, but not to all 10,000 devices that are on the network.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of examples here. Your home Wi-Fi system or the Internet of Things. Those are both mesh node networks that you add something on and it seems to become faster. So when you install your new Nest, when you install your new Blink camera or Ring camera or whatever, it's communicating back to that central router, but it's actually communicating to everything else to make it more efficient. And so in disaster and recovery services, in areas where communication infrastructure is down, that mesh network can be deployed relatively quickly, relatively inexpensively, and it creates this super functional communication system so that things can be assets, like you said, can be directed to the correct spot much faster.
Interesting. So, yeah, you see what you saw with this grant funding focus on communications. You saw a number of state and local agencies go that direction, ask for money for these big mesh communication networks so they could all talk to each other. Every agency within a given area could talk and, yes, view assets. And sorry if I'm using the tactical lingo. By assets, I mean, either airborne assets like airplanes or helicopters or boats that first responders have, or even patrol cars where they could view them in real time on these maps. And if they were equipped with video or audio, they could use those and see those over the over the mesh network.
Even bulldozers are considered assets, and tractors.
Sure, anything that moves is something you can use, right? And now this basically, that was kind of a model setup, and then you saw FEMA start to award money based on comms because they wanted all these partners to talk to each other. Now they wanted these agencies to be able to communicate with one another, even if they don't normally work together. And just think about how important this is. Like, with all the technology available today, you can just look at the Trump rally recently, where it's very easy to see how a simple communication breakdown between state, local, and federal partners almost resulted in that dude's sweet dome piece being displayed all over a bulletproof podium, right? Like They had something like 8 or 9 different frequencies and TAC channels, and none of these SWAT guys and sniper teams were talking to each other. So the point is, comms, muy importante. And now that we have comms established, and it's not just the mesh networks, we've got this FirstNet program now that basically says it's a cell network specifically for first responder that none of us have access to. So we could go on.
And that one is important because that allows, the chief of police in a major city to talk to a sheriff 5 counties over for a similarly related issue. Right. They can tap into that network.
And they can do it even when the cell phones don't work for the rest of us. So that's, yeah, exactly. So we can go on and on about comms, and Chris will totally nerd out on this stuff. And we can have a comms episode probably down the road. But,
will.
So So the next thing the grant started, and we're going in the time machine, we're getting closer to present day, but next the grants focused on getting state and local agencies on par with each other in terms of equipment. Now they can talk to each other. Now they need to be able to use, now they just need to have the same level of equipment. And over the last decade, I'm sure you've noticed the militarization of police forces, especially in large metropolitan areas.
Yep.
It's almost like these agencies lost their ties and their pinstripe pants overnight and went to NIJ level 3 and 4 tactical vests, new vehicles, weapons, all that stuff. And that was not by accident. And yes, they were all acting in concert. I have a very good friend. He works for an agency within a major tier 1 port on the West Coast. And back in the 2014 to 2018 grant cycle, he got every single piece of equipment he asked for during those times, during those individual grant cycles, because he figured out the buzzwords that FEMA was looking for. So this dude would put things like interagency operability and shared regional asset on every piece of gear in the grant application. And next thing you know, Uncle Sam is buying him new Tahoes, $1 million boats, etc. Because they had already put an emphasis on comms, and now they wanted to put an emphasis on interagency operability. So everybody working together.
You're telling me that I could have, at one point, gotten everything I wanted on my Santa wish list if I just knew the right buzzwords.
If you knew the buzzword Santa was looking for, that's right. If you were like, I want to have regional sleigh maintenance centers installed, and that's why I need a new Xbox, he'd be like, that's what's up. I need to be able to work on the sleigh no matter where I go. You're exactly right. So if you would have put the right buzzwords in, you can get whatever you want. The only difference is Santa isn't blowing our tax dollars. But yeah, no, it's true. And so now these agencies at these tier 1 and tier 2 ports, they can talk to each other, and they have good enough equipment that they can operate together. So then what? Well, the next thing, there was a ton of a lot of training grants popped up. So they wanted them all to be up to snuff as far as training goes. And we can put links to the courses, but it's all kinds of stuff from tactical courses, nuke rad courses, emergency management, everything in between. So our local police and first responders are more trained now than they have ever been ever. And that is increasing every single year. And in the grant years following, so now we're right into like the COVID era, we're into, the 2018 grant cycle.
Okay.
You saw a ton of emphasis on these grants now for CBRN. And Chris, you probably are very good at this. You can probably explain what CBRN means.
Ugh. So CBRN terrifies me, just to get that out there. It's absolutely on my list of like, do not touch. But CBRN stands for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives. So CBRN.
And it's a big word, right? It's there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yes. It refers to basically, to break it down, it's hazardous materials and threats that involve any type of those agents or situations. So it can be caused by intentional acts like terrorism or accidental events. And that could be an industrial accident or natural disaster, anything that involves these hazmat hazardous materials, right?
Yep.
So to break it down, let's kind of take it letter by letter. So C, chemical. That's going to be industrious or hazardous chemicals, oftentimes used in industry, that can cause injury, illness, death. I mean, it's chemicals that are in gas or liquid or solid form. They can still be spread through air, water, contact with surfaces. You're looking at things like chlorine gas, all of those train derailments that happened in Ohio. They spilled chlorine everywhere. That was a CBRN event because of what those trains were carrying. You look at other chemicals that are things like sarin gas or toxins like ricin. The one thing that chemicals have in common with each other is they're primarily man-made. They are your man-made death gas, if you want to think of it that way.
Man-made death gas. I've got some of that.
Not methane.
Yeah, okay. Never mind.
But then you compare that to biological, and that's going to be disease-causing organisms or toxins that affect humans, animals, plant life. They can still get to you through air, water, surfaces, things like that, but they're also found in nature. So, for example, anthrax, smallpox, hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, they can still be weaponized. And I'm sure there's a Tom Clancy novel out there somewhere that has weaponized
100%.
everything. But that's kind of the difference between your chemical and your biological. Is the biological came from or is a living organism, whereas the chemical, not necessarily. Right? Then we get into the radiological. And radiological and nuclear, they're interchangeable to a certain extent because they do both involve radiation. But the big thing about radiological is it's ionizing radiation. So it can cause acute or long-term health effects. This is often looked at as the dirty bomb scenario. So it's conventional explosives that are wrapped in this radioactive material, and then it detonates and it spreads radiation everywhere without the nuclear flash, right? So as an example, cesium-137, it is used in clocks for GPS timing. It is used in medical equipment. It is extremely radioactive. And if you had enough of it, you could wrap, a brick of C4 or TNT or whatever and just irradiate an entire area. Without the nuclear flash, you've just got a small little, cherry popper compared to a nuke. A nuclear event is going to be you have an actual nuclear event. Those are the ones that make the movies. They are
that sounds terrifying.
Yeah, it's catastrophic. It is the blast damage, the heat wave, the fallout, the intense radiation. The only two nuclear weapons that have been used in combat or in anger are obviously the ones that we dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But you also have nuclear events like Chernobyl or Fukushima that it's a nuclear event caused by a natural disaster or failure of some kind on a human level. So that's kind of the difference between radiological and nuclear. Got it. And just to point out, and we will definitely go into this on another episode, but from everything that we see in kind of the end of days apocalypse, post-apocalypse movies like Book of Eli and The Road and whatnot. Yep. That nuclear fallout that's constantly coming down from the sky and just poisoning everything. Modern nuclear weapons don't create fallout. They obliterate their own nuclear fallout. So interesting. That toxic ash is not so much of a problem as it was back in the 40s when we dropped the atomic bombs because of, again, scalability, dialable yield. So you can get the same size package with a much bigger bang. And because of that, there's not as much actual fallout.
So our nukes, they're more green now.
Exactly.
That's great.
Then we get into the E of CBRN, which is explosives. Explosive devices are materials. They can damage you through blast, fragmentation, heat, shrapnel, all sorts of things like that. A lot of time we see that with conventional bombs or even the improvised explosive devices, IEDs that were common in Iraq, Afghanistan. They got very good at developing IEDs of different types, anti-vehicle, anti-personnel, you name it. They got very good at engineering those.
Sure.
Speaking from experience on that one, but
yeah, you've been there.
You look at it. I got the T-shirt, and then I think I still have the T-shirt. It might be in rags by now. But you look at things like the Oklahoma City bombing. That was domestic terrorism. That was two things that were readily available. Two chemical compounds that were readily available on not the black market, but for sale. And he brought down an entire the Alfred P. Murrah
Right.
Federal Building in Oklahoma City, and that falls under that explosives part of CBRN.
Yep.
So when you're responding to this, it can be a terror attack, it can be an accident, it can be a natural disaster. There's all sorts of different aspects that kind of roll into CBRN and what causes it. But how do first responders, how does FEMA and the national government respond to that? And that's really with that training. So making sure they have the right training, the right equipment, the right hazmat teams, potentially military units, medical response, protective gear, containment strategies, decontamination procedures. All of those tools come from that training. And a lot of it comes down to early detection, public safety, medical treatment, knowing what you're doing before you get there and having that plan. If that all kind of jives together and you're still listening, that's what this podcast is about, is having that plan.
Yeah, no. And it's interesting because I always, when in my world, the only CBRN stuff I deal with, it's that detection. It's the detection equipment and getting these guys paid and getting money from the federal government for the local partners to get this equipment. But I didn't even think about, obviously there's the hazmat and there's all the stuff that goes into cleanup. You have to think about all the things you never want to use, because I only have visibility of things you actually use, which to date, knock on wood, has really just been the detection side of it. So I guess there's a whole bunch of stuff there.
And real quick, so this is a CBRN event that is ongoing, still has yet to be completely solved. Have you ever heard of the Los Animas River event?
I don't think so.
Okay. So back several years ago, about a decade ago, 2014, 2015, I believe, the Los Animas River in Colorado was poisoned. It's in a very popular area for like 1800s mines. And the miners back then, they really didn't care what they were digging up or what kind of trash they were leaving behind. They didn't fully understand the impacts of, environmental impact and protection and things like that. We saw it in, what was that movie? A Million Ways to Die in the West. Do you remember what he was talking about?
Yeah.
The silver miners have to eat hot ribs because that's the only thing they can taste, right?
They couldn't taste anything, right?
And then they, die from farting. Well, that was legitimate. And so the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was going through one of these abandoned mines, and there were things like uranium, plutonium, tungsten, arsenic, mercury, all sorts of different deposits that had turned into this sludge at the bottom of one of these wash pits in the mine. And when that got broken open, it flowed directly into the Los Animas River. It killed, I think it's like 98% of the fish, and it discolored the river. It is not swimmable. It is not drinkable. It is dead. And it is still in the process of being cleaned up. And there are villages and towns that relied on that river for their agriculture, their drinking water, all sorts of different things. And it was a simple leak, only about 2 inches wide, that caused this massive CBRN event that more than a decade later, we're still trying to figure out how to clean up.
That's crazy. So personally, I guess I've had really only one instance, and it was one of those all well that ends well things. But it's I can talk about, like, I personally have had the pleasure of working with a lot of different agencies on programs over the years. Guys at CBP have become close friends with a couple of these guys, especially the AMU guys, which is Aaron Marine Unit. And I was chatting with a buddy of mine who was he's a CBP agent still, and he said something stunning that, like, out of all the shipping containers that come into U.S. ports, they are only checking about 4% of these shipping containers. CBP is only checking about 4% of the, however many it is. I mean, millions and millions.
5?
It's crazy. And if you think about that, so this is the weird thing. It's pretty nuts. The fact that we're bringing in 11 million shipping containers. And so that means that, and that's just via the ports. That's just maritime, right? They're bringing them in on these container ships. There's about 11 million containers coming in a year, and we are not checking 10.5 million of them, not screening them. Now,
holy smokes.
That's not even counting the ones that arrive by rail and truck. Although I think those are checked at a higher rate. But here's the rub. So he says we're only checking 4% of these things, but we're checking the right 4%. So a lot of this stuff happens at sea. And what they'll do is they basically take a couple of screening vessels and they'll put seaborne equipment, these seaborne detection equipment on them, and they run alongside of these container ships. And it's kind of a makeshift, airport screening device and see if they get a hit. So it's crazy how sensitive this stuff is. This is my only personal story about this. I was cruising down the highway once with a friend of mine, the guy I mentioned previously, that's kind of the grant guru. He had this little pager looking device, and I think they're only set up to detect radiological, but they may detect other stuff. As we're driving down the freeway,
kind of dated yourself with that because
pager. It's what else is the size of a pager and looks like a pager? I don't know. It's like a cell phone, but it's one way. Anyway, but yeah, so we're cruising down the highway and the thing beeps, and they beep all the time, so much that you tune them out because there's just so much background radiation. Like you mentioned, cesium-137 is in like everything, right? And bananas are radioactive, believe it or not. They've got like potassium-14 in them or something. So everything beeps. They beep all the time. But it beeps again, and it beeps again, and it gets a little more frequent. And then we're both kind of looking at each other in this kind of like state of bewilderment. And I shit you not, he's getting ready to like phone it in. Like he's like, we got to shut down the freeway or something. We're looking around for a shady looking semi truck with Afghanistan license plates on it or something.
You're both thinking like the monkey going, oh,
it's the big one. Here's the big one. And then right then, I'm not kidding, minivan passes us, and it has these stickers on the side that says medical transport. And the guy sitting in the passenger seat, he looks like hell. He's got an IV bag hanging. And no shit, that was the source of the radiological alarm. He was obviously like a cancer patient or something. And you just don't realize like how hot you are on whatever drugs or cocktails they might have you on. So this little pager's beeping,
insane.
And it's a guy going down the freeway, and we both look at each other like, holy shit, that was it. And so now around the same time, you saw federal funding show up for what they called the Securing the Cities program. This Secure the Cities program was a 5-year program funded by DHS, and it's DNDO, which is Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. And that program basically sought to reduce the risk of a successful deployment of a radiological or nuclear attack on U.S. soil. And the program started in these five urban areas, so New York, Los Angeles, National Capital Region, they call it, which is like everything around D.C., and then Chicago and Houston. And it was very apparent then that the big one, I'm using air quotes now, the big one was going to be some kind of CBRN event. And now you're probably saying
that never happened.
But there wasn't any kind of chemical or nuclear attack. Does that mean that you're wrong or that it was thwarted? Well, you tell me. Was there some kind of biologic that showed up in late, 2019, early 2020 and nearly destroyed the country?
I
am not saying it was planned. I'm not saying it was an attack or anything like that. I am simply saying the federal government was planning for a biological attack, and we had a human-engineered pandemic show up. So if you're one of those people that still believes the narrative that some bat and a pangolin got it on and a hippopotamus filmed it and while a platypus watched or whatever, like, cool.
I can
all
see
right,
the
it was a wet
animations generating right now.
It was a wet market, whatever, fine, believe that. But regardless of whether this event has happened or it was stopped or it hasn't happened yet, the federal government feels that they are as prepared as they can be for it, and they've armed the state and local partners with all these tools that they feel are required to deal with any kind of CBRN event that might show up. So now, here's what's cool. We get into this post-COVID world, right? And these FEMA grants, they're bigger than they've ever been. $1.12 billion last year. Now, they've shifted their focus on these port security grant programs to giving preference on, wait for it, cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. Now, obviously, infrastructure, I'm using air quotes again, it's a big word. And almost anything is critical infrastructure nowadays.
Yeah, you're talking about power plants, comm lines, really anything.
Anything. But when you couple that with cybersecurity, it becomes pretty obvious that the next 9/11, like we know what it's going to be, or at least what the federal government is throwing over $1 billion a year to prevent. If we look back at the recent Texas power grid down situation, right?
Okay. Snowpocalypse. And even more recent, that Windows patch at the crippled air travel and banking for a little bit. And those two things were just accidents. So if you want to look at stuff that's happened on purpose, just recently we had a cyber attack here at SeaTac. It grounded hundreds of flights. I want to say maybe 300 flights. And then they didn't really, and then we didn't really hear anything else about it. I mean, you could Google it. It was on the news, but you just didn't really hear anything about it. And I don't know if they actually released even who was responsible for it. If we go back a little further, I really like to talk about this, and we could do an entire episode on this. But Chris, I don't know if you remember the Metcalf power grid attack. Do you remember that? Yes, that was a huge case study. That was all over the place.
Yeah, I assume that was probably something you guys studied. It didn't make. I mean, it made the news. It was there was articles on CNN and Wall Street Journal and stuff, but it fizzled out pretty quick. And if you look it up, so I've got a short clip here. This a little clip of a Wall Street Journal episode or article. But
okay,
so it says. The attack began just before 1 a.m. on April 16th last year, when someone slipped into an underground vault not far from a busy freeway and cut telephone cables. Within half an hour, snipers opened fire on a nearby electrical substation, shooting for 19 minutes. They surgically knocked out 17 giant transformers that funneled power to Silicon Valley. A minute before a police car arrived, the shooters disappeared into the night. To avoid blackout, electrical grid officials rerouted power around the site and asked power plants in Silicon Valley to produce more electricity. But it took utility workers nearly 27 days to make repairs and bring the substation back to life. So there was another great article by this retired Air Force colonel named Jennifer Hesterman that I follow. And it's funny, a buddy of mine had actually tweeted about her article, and she tweeted him back. So she is pretty active. I bet we could get her to come on and talk about it, because
very cool.
It's an awesome article. But so she explains that basically, if you took down just about any 9 substations at once, you could cripple the power grid. But if you took down the right 5 substations at once, you would cascade us back into the Stone Age. Meaning that if you took down the right ones all over the country, that the other substations around wouldn't be able to keep up with the exploding transformers, and it would just cascade us. It would cascade us back into the Stone Age. Now, this was 11 years ago. So back when you pretty much had to do physical damage to a substation in order to take them down.
Yeah, now, and that was, I remember it wasn't just the Metcalf attack, because it started with that one, but there were attacks in North Carolina, Texas, New York, and like they'd shoot at transformers and bring them down, take down that substation, and almost none of them got caught, because I think they all had lookouts.
I don't think anybody got caught. Now, there was one recently in Tacoma, and they did the same thing, shot up a substation, tried to take down the power, and they actually did get caught. And it was just 2 guys trying to rob a bank, and they were trying to shut the power down by the bank. So not a true story, not at all related. Not at all related, right?
But yeah, you look at the probing attack style and just testing the system and the limits. That's scary.
And now let me ask you, do you think that in the last decade we have become more or less networked and connected to the internet?
I mean, just based on the amount of things that I have compared to 10 years ago, I'm going to say more.
So now do you understand why cybersecurity at a national level is so incredibly important? If you coupled that kind of cascading attack on infrastructure with something like our GPS system, that would be catastrophic, if not cataclysmic. A lot of people don't understand how important GPS is to our daily lives. It's not just the navigation, but GPS is super critical to the banking system. Without GPS, we can't actually make transactions because basically the banks utilize the super precise time you get from GPS. And so we couldn't process financial transactions because they need this, billionth of a second time, so they know that you're not taking the same money out of the same account at the exact same time. So they use the GPS time standard in order to standardize all these banking and SWIFT transactions.
That's the, what is it? The Citibank ATM hack that's been going around.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Well, you're putting your own money into your own bank account and they just don't figure it out in time. Right. So now here's where I'm going to go off the conspiracy theory end a little bit. But just earlier this year, Warzone publication reported, this was really good, that a Chinese satellite was observed grabbing another satellite and pulling it out of its normal geosynchronous orbit and into what they called a super graveyard drift orbit. And so we know we can cripple GPS. That's physically, again, not through the cybersecurity angle. And everybody thinks, well, if they took down GPS, it'd kind of mess it up for everybody. But you've got the Russian government has something called GLONASS that maybe a lot of people, unless they are really nerds like us, follow. But there is an alternative to GPS that the Russian government runs. So if you had a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, like, say, GPS and or power grid at the same time, it would really only affect us. You could have other actors in the world that would still go all about their daily lives, and we would literally be living in the Stone Age again with no access to electricity or money. So is that super duper terrifying?
Well, yes, but this is all open source information. None of this is classified, and
no. This is all just us
knowledge,
right?
Which is even more scary.
Right. This is just, we're putting it in such a way that it's digestible, but we can post all of the links so you can fact check all this. Like, this is all, I know this is a little down a rabbit hole, but earlier we had said, I think in episode 1, we said that we kind of wanted to be your S2 shop, right? We want to provide actionable information. So I've gone down one hell of a rabbit hole here, but I would put that to you, Chris. Follow the money. But so now what, Chris? So what is your advice then? Where do you go from there having the knowledge?
Well, I think the biggest part of this episode, and thank you for listening to the full 3, like we asked, you are almost done with your tutorial.
Maybe give us 4.
Yeah, maybe give us 4. But
4 is going to be different. We're going to go a completely different direction with 4.
I think so. I'm excited about 4. The biggest part of this is paying attention and deciding what you want to focus on, just like the federal government does. Do they want to focus on communications or CBRN or critical infrastructure? Pay attention to what's going on and decide what you need or want to focus on. Is it the big stuff that the federal government is good at predicting but bad at mitigating? Is it the natural disaster in your area? Like, I grew up in the Omaha area, so tornadoes were pretty frequent. Mm-hmm. Is it the car accident on the way to pick up the kids from school and having a plan in place to get them home while you're tied up on the side of the highway waiting for a tow truck? So any way you look at it, you have to pay attention and have that plan. Consider it your own continuity of operations. And
I like it. And I guess this is if I could take any piece of advice from the federal government, which I normally would not do, but based on what you've said with that continuity of operations, would be prepare for the one thing all the way. Don't just half-ass a bunch of stuff, right? Prepare until you are prepared to deal with that thing, and then move on to the next thing.
Yeah, don't be just some random loot drop for
Right.
the apocalypse, but actually take a vested interest in it. So I think understanding the limitations of the federal government response effort, I mean, for any given disaster is a key part of the whole prepping idea, right? So they called preppers crazy in the 50s and 60s for building bunkers in their backyards. And we all had the shiniest of tinfoil hats in the 90s with the Y2K fears. But the prepper ideology is growing, and it's at this exponential faster than ever pace. And part of that is because we witnessed firsthand the capabilities and the failures of the federal government in disaster response and planning, especially when it came to things like Katrina or the Camp Fire and all of the Ohio derailments, things like that.
It's almost like people are noticing things.
Almost. And I think a big part of that is my one piece of advice to really close out this episode is pay attention to your surroundings and change your perspective to maybe just shift those surroundings to a greater scale and take responsibility for it, own it. Because remember, and AC, I think you'll agree with me on this, you are your own stakeholder.